Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne and I talk about books. Welcome to another edition of the King Chronicles. Today, in case you missed the thumbnail or the title of the video, we're going to be discussing Cujo. If this is your first time here, hi, hello, and welcome. Just to give you a little bit of a rundown on what the King Chronicles is all about, I am reading Stephen King's books in chronological order. Each book is getting its own video where we discuss fun facts, what my thoughts were, characters, themes, and motifs that go throughout the book, and any connections to previously published Stephen King works. I do have a playlist that I will link up above if you are interested in that, if you want to revisit any of our videos up until this point. And this video is very spoiler heavy, so if you have not read the book, then I suggest you maybe go read the book before you come back and discuss this with us today. All right, so without further ado, let's just dive right in. First thing, Cujo was actually the second Stephen King book that I ever read, Pet Sematary being the first. I remember reading this. I remember being utterly terrified by it because I was actually attacked by a dog. I was literally chased down the street as a kid. And so I've never really been a fan of dogs since then. So the idea of being stuck in a car with a rabid dog trying to like get at you and kill you was terrifying to me. But it was also very interesting to me because this experience of the second read through was very different. I was in 7th or 8th grade whenever I read Cujo for the first time. As you all know, there's a lot of content in this book that would go over the head of a 7th grader or an 8th grader. And so this was definitely a different reading experience for me this time. This book was published in 1981 under Viking Press. And it actually won the British Fantasy Award in 1982 and was adapted into a film in 1983. I have never seen the film because of reasons that I have already explained. This is actually one of his more infamous novels in that this is the novel that everybody talks about. Most of you who are familiar with King and his work at all know that he was an alcoholic and a drug addict at various points in his career. At this point, when this book was being written, he had a pretty bad coke habit as well as being an alcoholic, and has stated numerous times that he doesn't really remember writing a lot of this book, which he also says that he really regrets. So in doing the research for this is something that I was actually completely unaware of, so maybe it'll be new to some of you as well. This book was actually inspired, the idea of this book was inspired by a motorcycle trip that he took, and his motorcycle broke down and he ended up at an auto shop. And this giant ass Saint Bernard comes out of the garage and starts growling at him. And the mechanic comes in and like hits him with a wrench and is like, fucking stop it. That's kind of what started getting the wheels turning for King with this. In addition to, around the same time, there was a story about a young girl who was killed by a Saint Bernard. That was mauled to death by a Saint Bernard somewhere close by where he was living. So those two things coupled together, you know, kind of brought Cujo to life. And also, apparently King owned a Pinto at the time, which were notoriously unreliable, which is one of the reasons that it was included as Donna's car. So those are fun facts. Let me go into what my thoughts on the book are. Like I said, I've been scared of dogs for the majority of my life. Larger dogs, like small dogs, little ankle biters, and you know, not scared of those, but being scared of larger dogs, this book was pretty scary to me at certain points. This is also one of those books that like has sort of a straightforward villain, right? So, you know, when you look at a lot of his other more supernaturally centered books, you know, the villain is a little bit more vague because it is that supernatural element, and this is literally just a rabid dog, right? So you have a very straightforward villain, which is something that we don't or haven't seen a ton of up until this point. There is actually a really vague nod to the supernatural at the beginning, which I actually caught in the first couple of pages of the book, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. You know, the Trenton family, they're a nice, quiet family of nice people that really don't deserve the things that end up happening to them, which, you know, really isn't outside of a lot of King's other works as well. So this is a book that there's 3 different storylines that are actually happening here. So you have the storyline of Donna and Tad. They're stuck in the Pinto fighting for their lives. You have the story of Vic, who is fighting for the survival of his ad company that he works for. They're dealing with a very bad PR thing. And so that is why Vic is away at the time that things happen with Donna and Tad. And then you also have the separate storyline of the Chambers family. And the Chambers family is the family who owned Cujo. You have Charity, and I cannot remember her son's name. And Charity is kind of grappling with the possibility of leaving her husband and what the repercussions of that might be. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there's 3 different storylines, which is interesting because of the way that this book is formatted. So there aren't any chapters and there really aren't any page breaks either. So the pace of this is just relentless. So you end up switching between these different perspectives, and it can be very jarring because one of the things that I noticed is, especially once we reach the parts where Tad and Donna are stuck in the Pinto, you go from these really, really tense scenes to like a flashback of, like something else that had happened previously, or whatever the case may be, something that is far less tense. And so there's like this back and forth that kind of leaves you exhausted in a way. So even though the core of this book takes place in a Pinto in the middle of summer, I think that because of the way that it was plotted and the way that it was written, it is actually a very effective thriller for those reasons. So let's talk about specific characters, right? So obviously our namesake of the book is Cujo. He's a giant Saint Bernard, and he seems like he is just the sweetest dog until, he gets infected with the rabies. And despite being the main character of the book, he actually gets the least amount of page time, which is interesting. And like I said, he's tried to be a really good dog. He loves his people, but this infection that is just spreading through his body is what's causing him to, do the terrible things that he is doing and attacking these people. And one of the interesting lines to me in that was, I think it was, free will was not a factor. And, that really speaks to the fact that, he was always a good boy. He was the goodest boy. So from there, we move on to the Trenton family. We'll start with Vic. He's a man who really loves his family, and while I wasn't super interested in the plot line that had to do with his ad agency and everything, I think that he's a good man. I think that he is decisive. We see that in the dealings with his ad company and, trying to save that account that is really one of the only things that's keeping their company afloat. He takes action when needed and isn't afraid to do that. One of the ways that we see that is because when everything comes out about Donna and their affair, he really is less than sure about whether or not he actually is going to continue to stay married to her whenever he comes back from this trip. So from there, we're going to talk about Donna. And Donna, to me, she was a real polarizing character for me. There were times that I liked her character, and then there were times that I really hated her character. There are arguments that you could make about her. I think that she's one of the most compelling characters in the book. And I also think that when you really start looking into her, you can make arguments for both sides on whether or not she was a decisive woman or whether she was not, right? You could really argue that she was one of the most transformative characters in the book, but was she really? You know what I mean? When we meet her, she has moved to a new state. She didn't want to move to a new state, but she let it happen, right? She's a stay-at-home mom. She doesn't have a job. She has inadvertently fell into this affair with a dude that was refinishing some furniture for her. She's a bored housewife, essentially, who refuses to make decisions for herself. She drifted into this affair, and then as she decides to kind of extricate herself from this affair, she likens it to waking up from a fever, is I think the way that it was written. And then of course, whenever shit hits the fan, she talks about her frustration and, being a stay-at-home mom and being scared about being a stay-at-home mom and her fear of getting old and not having accomplished anything and this, that, and the third. And it's all right, cool. But if you feel that way, you probably need to do something about it, right? And maybe that's just the modern woman in me versus this was published in 1981. And so things did look very different for women in that particular time period. And this is also a woman being written by a man. We also have to take those things into account, right? as things come out, Vic leaves for his trip. He's like, okay, we're going to talk about this whenever I come back. Cool, right? She just wants her life to go back to normal. Vic, on the other hand, is really not sure whether or not he wants this to, continue to go back to normal. But then after all of these things, seeing that she, at this point, really hasn't been forced to make a decision, and then all of a sudden you throw her into this really traumatic situation where she's having to fight for the life of herself and for her son, right? So you would think that she would really take charge in that situation and do whatever it is that she has to do. And you could argue that she did do those things. I would argue that she didn't. Ultimately, she does save herself. We know that she takes the baseball bat, she drives the baseball bat through places in this dog. That was really gruesome. She saves herself with the baseball bat. And so you think at that point that everything is going to be fine. And it's not, because, yeah, she was forced to act. Had she acted before she actually did, then she would have not only been able to save her life, but she would have been able to save her son's life. A lot of the time that's in the Pinto is spent, because it is very, very hot outside, right? And I completely understand that as hot as it is outside, it is also ridiculously hot in the car. It's even hotter in the car. And so I fully understand why she was so lethargic and everything in the car, right? But a lot of that time is spent like trying to keep his spirits up and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, I get that to a point, but it like, girl, you got to do something. And she fails to act until it's too late. I think that it could be argued that she didn't really change. So then we have the plot line that is the Chambers plot line, right? So we know that Joe Chambers is the one that owns the auto shop that, all of this book, or a good portion of this book, is taking place at. But then there's this like little subplot, right? So we learn that Joe is like less than a desirable man. And I'm just gonna lump the whole Chambers family together. I'm not gonna talk about each of them specifically. But you learn from the get-go that, what is his name? That Joe is really not that great of a guy. He's kind of a shithead, actually. And Charity, for whatever reason, she comes from like a bougie family and loves her sister, but her sister is also bougie and subsequently, doesn't like her husband. Well, her son just worships the ground that her husband walks on. And having seen how her husband has turned out, is really afraid that her son is also going to turn out the same way. Like, she wants more for him. She wants more for herself, but more than that, she wants more for her son, right? And so she actually ends up winning lottery money, and she's like, oh shit, like, this is my chance to get out of here, right? So you have a woman who has basically dealt with an abusive husband for a lot of her life, and she has made the decision she's going to take this lottery money, she's going to go and she's going to see her sister, and she's likely going to leave her husband. She's wanting to show her son that there's more to the world than their little farm and little auto shop. She does not have to follow, or he does not have to follow in her husband's footsteps. And so this storyline was really compelling to me personally. I don't know, I was just really interested in what Charity was going to do, because there were some exchanges between Charity and Joe after they left, that were really interesting. Like, you saw Charity, who was an abused woman for the most part, like really say, no, this is what we're going to do. Take it or leave it, And it was really interesting to me because you have the juxtaposition of Donna, who has, really floated through life. People have taken care of her. She's never really had to make decisions. She's being forced to make a decision, like absolutely forced to make that decision to really, to save her life and the life of her son. And then you have Charity, who is given this amazing set of circumstances, having, come into this money, right? And she makes a conscious choice to make a decision. She's not being forced. She could have taken that money and done whatever else she wanted to do with it. She could have given it to her husband and kept going on, but she chose to not do that. She made that conscious decision, right? And so since she made that decision, to leave her husband, we see that the decision actually is taken out of her hands, because after she leaves, Cujo takes Joe's life. And so the decision that she made to leave, now she doesn't even have to worry about anymore, because her husband has been removed from the picture. Not because she wanted that terrible thing to befall her husband, but, so it's just funny to me that you have a woman that really like went in, she took charge, she was going to do the damn thing, and then ultimately doesn't, like, has that decision taken away from her, versus you have Donna who, like, these decisions, like, they're shoving these decisions at her and she can't make a single one. You know, it's just very interesting to me, that whole juxtaposition. So all right, so from there we're going to move into connections, and there are several different connections to this one actually. So obviously Cujo is a Castle Rock story, right? One of the Castle Rock books that we have read before now is actually Dead Zone, which is explicitly mentioned in Cujo in the first couple of pages. So there are a couple of different connections obviously to Dead Zone. First being characters, we have George Bannerman, who is the sheriff, who asked Johnny in the Dead Zone to help catch Frank Dodd. To, you know, he appears, and unfortunately he does meet his doom at the hands of Cujo as well. And like I said, from the very beginning, the first couple of pages of this book, it actually does talk about the Dead Zone explicitly, and talks about Frank Dodd and the things that he did, how he was this darkness that came to Castle Rock, right? And we know that Cujo takes place 5 years after the events that happened in the Dead Zone. So then there's actually a section on page 4 of my paperback, right? So it says, but time passed, 5 years of time. The monster was gone, the monster was dead. Frank Dodd moldered inside his coffin. Except that the monster never dies. Werewolf, vampire, ghoul, unnameable creature from the wastes. The monster never dies. It came to Castle Rock again in the summer of 1980. So this has a lot of different implications to me, right? So this is one of those things that I read through and I was like, oh, okay, well, the monster never dies. So obviously we know that the physical form of Frank Dodd is dead, right? So obviously that particular monster is dead. But the fact that we know that Frank Dodd is physically dead, and then they talk about the monster coming back to Castle Rock 5 years later, seems to imply to me that there is something more sinister that has really kind of infiltrated Castle Rock. Some sort of like dark presence, right? And I think that we see it whenever, like, you know, there's the monster words that Tad has tacked to his bedroom wall because of the darkness in the closet. There is some kind of dark entity that has really like infiltrated this area. First, taking residence in Frank Dodd. Second, in not necessarily taking precedence inside of Cujo, because we know that that's rabies. We know that that is something, you know, that is natural. But did this presence like steer him to the place that he, you know, hadn't been before, that made him get bit by this bat or whatever? And then of course, like, again, the darkness that we're talking about inside of Tad's closet. So those are really the only connections that I could find to any previously published works. But I am going to talk about, you know, like, this is my theory. These are things that I was talking about. But I think that I'm not the only person that thinks this, because when we talk about Castle Rock, the television series, right? The Hulu television series, which I know a lot of people aren't a fan of. I personally enjoyed it. I enjoyed the fan service, and the second season was way better than the first, I will say that. But in both seasons of the show, it takes place in Castle Rock, obviously, but it really starts to explore this dark entity that has infiltrated the town of Castle Rock. And so, like, I feel like I'm not the only person that sees that. You know, in this particular book, I think that is something that other people have also noticed, which is what caused them to explore that in the TV series as well. So I don't know, maybe I'm just like reaching. Like, leave your thoughts down below on like how you feel about that. Do you think I'm right? Well, not that I'm right, but like, what are your thoughts? I'm curious on what your thoughts are. So, but yeah, that is really all I have today. That is Cujo. Obviously, I feel like this one was a little bit longer than some of our other ones, just because I do feel like there was a little bit more to talk about. But I do see that Cujo tends to be very polarizing to people. Either people really enjoy it or they really don't. I like it. I think that I'll always hold it a little bit close because it was one of the first Kings that I read, but also like the process of going through and like really analyzing this for the series. I think I see his books very differently now that I'm going through and doing this series than I did when I read them through the first time. So I look forward to continuing the series and continuing to talk about these books. So anyway, okay, that's it. That is Cujo. Let me know what your thoughts are down below. I would love to discuss. I would say keep it spoiler free, but we don't care about spoilers here in the King Chronicles, because my assumption is you read the book if you've made it to the end. You can also contact me on Twitter, Goodreads, and Instagram if you so desire. All of those links can be found in the dial bar below. If this is your first time here, hi, hello, and welcome. If this is your first King Chronicles, hi, hello, and welcome as well. Remember that there is a full playlist that you can peruse at your leisure with all of King's books previously published. If this is your first time here and you like what you see and you want to see more, you can click thumbs up. You can click subscribe if you haven't already, and you can also click the little bell doodad. You'll be notified whenever I upload videos. As always, thank you guys so very much for watching. Next time we will be discussing different seasons. I look forward to it. This will be our first novella collection that we'll be talking about. So I'm looking forward to it. See you guys next time. Bye.